Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at adding the My Little Grid custom grid to your applications from the absolute basics to advanced. Today we're going to be looking at the My Little Grid custom grid control, originally written by James Clutho and now controlled by Gary Bean. This excellent piece of software is now free to use, without cost. What we're going to do today is we're going to add a My Little Grid control to this dialog you see in front of you, to allow us to display information on a grid. We have added 3 files to this folder. First of all is the MLG include file. This is the include file that ships with My Little Grid that lets you access the software. The second file is a static linked library. My Little Grid ships with 2 options. You can either access the software in a dynamic linked library, a DLL, or in a static linked library, an SLL. Today we're going to be using the SLL, the static linked library. This is a pre-compiled piece of code that can be linked in with your own application. That way, when you end up with your application, there is no DLL to distribute with it. The code is inside your own executable. The third file we're going to use today is MLG Lite Utilities. This is a cut-down version of the full MLG utilities we wrote to support My Little Grid. So let's have a look at the code. So the first thing to do is to include in both the include file for the MLG library and the link to the static linked library. We can do this by adding 3 simple lines of code. First, the setting of a constant, MLG SLL, which is referenced for within the MLG include library. This tells that library that we're going to be using MLG as a static linked library as opposed to a DLL. Then the include file itself, and then the link to include in our static linked library. After this, we're going to include in our utilities library. We'll cover the details of that library shortly. So now that we have the includes out of the way, let's look at the dialog itself. Our dialog here has simply got one object on it, the exit button. We want to position a grid on this dialog. So firstly, we'll set the location on the dialog that the grid is going to occupy. We'll do this after the PB forms in dialog, because this control will be controlled outside of PB forms. We're setting 4 variables up, an X and a Y coordinate, to define the starting position. Counting from the top left-hand corner of the dialog, this is where the grid is going to appear. Then we have 2 other variables, one for the grid's width and one for the grid's height. My Little Grid does come with a great many options, which can at first be a little confusing. However, we'll cover these one at a time. I'm going to define a local variable called strMenu. In our later videos on this series, we're going to put a menu on the right-click button. But for the moment, we'll leave this as unpopulated. Now we've come to the point where we can actually add the grid control to the screen. We can do this using the control add command. It's followed by quite a number of parameters, and we're going to go through these one at a time. The first parameter is the name of the object, My Little Grid. That's followed by the dialog handle, and then the control handle on the dialog. We'll set these up shortly. The parameters that follow that configure how the grid appears. We'll cover these one at a time. The first is our column widths. There are going to be a certain number of columns in our grid. Each of those columns is going to be a specific width. You'll probably want to set your width of columns to match the data that's going to be contained within those columns. So let's set the column widths first of all. We've defined it here as a constant. So we'll nip back to the top of our application and we'll define this constant. So these are the constants we're going to be using in our application. I set a constant up for the maximum number of grid columns we're going to have in the grid to be 5. The maximum number of rows to be 50. And I've set the column widths to contain the width of our 5 columns and a first column, which is the row selector column, to be 20 dialog units wide. So we can see here the first column will be 50 and the final column will be 200 units wide. And I've defined the names of the columns in a comma delimited string with the ID, first name, surname, department and division. So now that we've set those constants, the rest of the parameters will make more sense. We've set the column widths. We'll come back to these other parameters in a later video. The R parameter is the number of rows. So our maximum rows is going to be 50. The menu we have as a 0 string at the moment, that will be for a later video. The C is for the number of columns. So we set a constant here for our 5 columns. And these other parameters we'll cover again in a later video. The final set of parameters are our X and Y coordinates, where our grid starts on the screen, the grid width and the grid height. And the final parameter is a constant defined within the MyLittleGrid libraries themselves. So there are 2 other things we'll need to set up at the beginning of our code. We have not yet defined the value of the object constant for the grid itself. So let's go back to the beginning of the code and set that up. So we're going to give that a value of 3000 to keep it away from all the other objects. And I'm setting up a global variable to be the Windows handle for the grid itself. We'll be using the Windows handle quite a lot in some of our calls later. So now that we've got our grid added to the dialog, we need to capture the Windows handle to the new global variable we've just set up using the control handle command. We give the control handle the dialog handle and the object on the dialog's handle, and that gives us the Windows handle. And as I said previously, we'll be using the Windows handle exclusively to communicate with the grid. That's the first part of the configuration of the grid completed. We now have the grid set up to appear on the screen, but there are a few other things we need to set. I prepared a macro in our library which will make this a lot simpler. The MLG Lite Utilities contains a number of macros and functions to make life a little easier for setting up your grids. The one we're going to use here is the prep grid macro. This basically puts a series of commands into our code to save us typing them every time we wish to set up a new grid. There may be some of your dialogues that will have multiple grids on them, but for today we're concentrating on a single grid on a single dialog. So the use of this grid has a number of parameters. The Windows handle for the grid, the maximum number of grid rows, the maximum number of grid columns, and what we want the sheet or tab to be named. And this is tab number 1. You can have a multiple of tabs on any particular grid, but we'll concentrate today on having a single tab, which we're going to call Demo Grid. So before we go further with the configuration of this grid, there's one key piece of code we need to actually put into our pbmain function. Right at the beginning of the pbmain, before we actually show the dialog, we need to make a call to this routine, MLG init. This is the initialization routine that initializes the grid control. If we try running the control now, we'll see we have a basic grid on screen. We have the 5 columns we've asked the grid to display. We have the tab at the bottom of the grid showing the name of the worksheet. And we have operational scroll bars. What we don't have yet is the header names for each of the columns. It has defaulted to the letters, and we have no data within the grid itself. But we do have a basic grid on the screen, so we have achieved stage 1. So for stage 2, let's put some content into the grid. We'll want first of all to set the names of each of the columns. Now there is a function in our light library that will allow us to do that. This small function called setColumnNames takes two parameters, the grid handle and a string of the column names. It will then work out how many columns in the grid, and for each of these columns it will put into row 0, which is the header line, for the column we're dealing with, and it will parse out the name of the individual column. So with a single line of code, we can put in the names of the columns. And there are our names. They are automatically centered in each of the columns. And our column names are driven by this string constant we set up at the beginning of the code. Now to make the grid slightly more appealing, we can change the color of the grid. We can change alternate rows to be separate colors using another function within a library called color bank grid rows. This will change each alternate row to a different color, like so. If you don't like the color we've picked here, you can always pick a different one. There are many colors in PowerBasic. If we then pick something a little less striking, perhaps a light green, and we now have a grid. The grid by default will allow the user to edit it. So the grid can be quite happily used at this point for taking information in. If you're putting a lot of data into your grid, you have a number of ways of doing this. One of the mechanisms is to actually use the MLG put command to put value into a specific cell on the grid. The last parameter of that command is either going to be a 0 or a 1. If it's a 0, then the grid is not automatically redrawn. So I've created a little macro called grid refresh, which you'll see in your library, which executes a simple command to refresh the grid on screen. So for efficiency, it's always best putting information into the grid but setting it not to display the update straight away. Put all your changes in and then call a grid refresh command at the end to display the whole grid at that point. This lets the grid updates happen very much faster. So now that we've prepared our grid with the headers and the configuration, we're now going to have a look at putting some data into the grid itself. So if we have a look at the event handler, the callback function of our dialog, we're going to put our code into the initialization section of this callback function. We're going to call one of the functions in our library to fill a particular column with a particular value. This takes three parameters: the grid handle, the column into which we want to put our data, and the text that we want to put in. This will fill the entire column with one piece of text. And there is our data into the very first column. So what if we want to fill the first column with a row number? Well, there is a function designed to do just that, called fill column with row number. And now we have the row number, between 1 and 50. Each of the columns, though, is still editable by the user. Now, depending on your application, you may not want the user to update a particular column, or in fact, perhaps the entire grid. So there's another function we can call to mark the entire grid as read-only. Each of these functions calls the lower level My Little Grid routines. So please feel free to have a look at these functions to see how they're actually doing it. This particular one is calling two subfunctions, first to get the number of columns in the grid, then the number of rows in the grid, so this is entirely dynamic, and then for each row and each column it will send this message to the grid. and the message being sent is effectively locking each cell on the grid. So if we try running this now, it will still display the grid and it will still populate the first column, but attempting to click on any of the cells in the grid will not give you a cursor to actually do any input, so the whole grid is now read-only, which in some circumstances you may well wish when just displaying information to the user. So what if you want to make some information editable and some not? There are two ways of doing this. We can define the entire column as being read-only when the grid is set up, or we can actually define a single cell as being writable. We'll cover the column setting in the next video, but today we're going to show you two little routines to either lock or unlock an individual cell. We have a function called unlock cell. So since we've marked the whole grid as read-only, we're now unlocking row 2, column 3. So if we run that now, and we're going to row 2, column 3. So this cell is now editable, but none of the others are. So we've unlocked a single cell. So this could be done inside your code, conditional on the data within a grid. You can also use these commands to mark a particular cell with a particular background color to highlight to the user something that is wrong, incorrect, or just as a method for display. So we're going to mark row 2, column 3 with a background color of yellow. And there it is. This is highlighting the single cell on our entire grid that is editable. There are a number of colour slots predefined in My Little Grid, a total of 16 slots. These, although they come with specific colours set up initially, you can reset these using a send message command. These are the predefined slots and colours set up in My Little Grid. You can quite easily override these and change the slot 2 from red to some other colour by quite simply sending this message to slot 2 with your selected colour. And then anytime you use slot 2 to colour something on a grid, it will appear in your new colour. So what we've done today is we have quite easily placed a brand new grid on our dialog. We have set the number of columns and the number of rows. We have populated the header line with text of our choosing, and we have populated each of the rows with an incremental row number. We've shown how to mark each alternate row with a different colour to allow it to be highlighted. We've also been able to actually mark the entire grid as read-only, or make individual cells read-only or writable. My Little Grid does have some other features that come out of the box. If, for example, we had a grid on screen which has a large number of columns that are not initially visible to the user, there are scroll bars to allow you to scroll right and left, up and down. However, there are two small gadgets down at the bottom of our grid. If we drag this splitter bar to the left and stop it there, we can see that it's set to display the first 3.5 columns, and the right hand side of the grid will still move. So if you have a large grid and you wish to keep the first 2 or 3 columns, this is an easy way of doing it without having to write any code whatsoever. The same functionality also works for vertical. So you could keep the first 3 rows at the top and scroll up and down. This is a very useful facility for your users. In the next video, we will cover some more configuration options to allow you to set columns to be checkboxes and drop-down menus. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.